Hello everyone and welcome to my beginner's guide to Kerbal Space Program. Oh, I want to get started right away with this one. We've got ourselves a mission to perform. And the mission is to put our craft into a very specific orbit here about the moon. If we go over to this second note here on the contract, we not only have to have a very specific apoapsis and periapsis and an inclination, but also a longitude of the ascending node and an argument of periapsis. So we're going to talk about what exactly do those last two things mean, as well, because of the very specific nature of this orbit. We're going to be needing to do normal burns and radial burns, so we'll be getting to explore what the uses of burning in those directions are as well. As for the craft itself, we'll be meeting that soon enough. And for the booster, well, there's really no new principles involved in this booster at all, so I'm not going to talk about its construction in the least. You can see it's a very simple one. One thing I will point out is with just a basic probe body, I don't have locking to prograde and locking to retrograde features, so instead I'm just letting the natural aerodynamics of this vessel carry it through its proper gravity turn. If you design your vessels appropriately, they should be able to do exactly what you're seeing here. I'm not putting in any inputs at all. And as always, there'll be a link in the description to the craft file in case you want to play with this yourself. And if you need some help getting into orbit, I do have videos on that topic, so make sure to check those out because this one is not going to be talking about that. Alrighty, so that is our parking orbit. We use this opportunity to take a look at the probe. Aim the camera up here, take a look at it. Not really much to it. It's got the materials bay, not because there's science for me to collect over there, but because the contract had the requirement to put the materials bay on it. Otherwise, it is just a octo probe core with a bunch of solar panels around it. I don't know, I like the look of all the solar panels surrounding it. Its most distinctive feature are these two HG-5 high gain antennas. These are relay antennas, which might hint to the fact that this probe might have a secondary purpose that I'll talk about towards the end of the video. But right now, why don't we start to plot our ejection out to the moon? I still have 498 meters per second left in just the booster. I might as well put it to use to help me get out towards the moon. The probe itself has 1,448 meters per second in it, which should be plenty to do what I want to do with it, including its secondary mission. Okay, we'll focus our view on the moon. And the last time we came to the moon, I just put myself into a nice low orbit about the moon, but now I want to match this orbit. Now, one thing to pay particular attention to is which way this orbit's going around. You see this sort of highlighted part of the orbit that's going round and round in a circle? That's telling us we want to go around in this direction. So we want to insert ourselves onto this side of the orbit so that as we're coming in, by the way, from this direction and leaving the moon in this direction, we want to be going in the same direction as the orbit is. So I'm going to use just the time tools. I got to select the maneuver here. There we are. To kind of move that over to the other side. And I get to a point where I can't move it enough. It won't go any further, so that tells me I need to put a little bit more prograde into this. My goal here is to take a look at my closest approach to the moon and have that periapsis be just underneath the orbit. Now, I'm not going to actually be hitting the orbit just yet. We'll deal with that in just a little bit. But what I want it to be is just underneath it. So let's see if I can do this with adjusting the time. What's nice about adjusting the time as opposed to the burn is that adjusting the time doesn't cost you any more fuel. So we'll push this periapsis as far out as we can go using the time adjust tool. You can see I'm actually going past where my target is. but that seems to be about as far as it's going to want to go. And then we'll use a little bit of retrograde here to bring it in. We use the time tool to really fine adjust that. No, I'm going to need a little bit of prograde, and then use the time tool to fine adjust that so that my periapsis is just as best as I can get it underneath my orbit. That's going to be my ejection burn. Well, let's get that out of the way. Now, as we approach this burn, notice that the burn is 158.8 meters per second, but I only have 428 meters per second left in this booster. So we're going to have to be staging partway through the burn. Notice that if you take a look at the bar, there's actually a little line here, including staging numbers to tell you that, yeah, this part here is going to run on stage number 1, and this part here is going to run on stage number 0. So right burn indicator here gets down to this line. That's when we're going to have to do our staging. The timing, KSP does a good job of calculating how much time this is going to take, even with the fact that this is going to be on 2 different stages with 2 different engines. So we're still going to do the same thing. We want to split this time in half, but we have this set that already it's going to be splitting in half with this set at 50%. So basically when this start burn in time gets down to 0, we're going to be punching it. 3, 2, 1, and go. Pressing Z, full thrust. And we have to stay in this view because you can't stage from map view. Then we'll hit that stage, and now we're on our little tiny spark engine to finish off the rest, which is going to take a little bit longer. I'm also going to want to watch this from the moon's perspective. Here comes our trajectory. And this doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to be doing a correction anyway. I went a little bit past, but that's okay. No problem. Okay, so now we're on to the next phase of this. What we want is this periapsis to be touching just the very outside of this orbit, just to be just touching it. Okay. So in order to do that, we need to move this trajectory up. We do that by using a normal burn. So out in the middle of our trajectory, I'm going to be putting a maneuver about halfway. There's no precision to this. It just gives me the dot. There it is. I'm going to add a maneuver. So the normal directions are these 2 purple triangle-y icons. We have the positive normal direction going this way, going north on our screen, or up, and the negative normal going down, or south on the screen. And you can see that the normal vectors are perpendicular to the plane of our orbit. So this is the one we're going to need to do to get our trajectory to go up. Now this is not going to be too much of a burn, so I'm going to do this by using the slider here. I'm going to go up, I don't know, 2 meter per second intervals. We're going to scroll on here, in here, and take a look at this periapsis, and we're going to start pushing in the positive normal direction, and you can see it starting to go up like that. Now what I also want to do is put this in its most efficient location that I can. You can drag it back and forth. In fact, I think I might just try that. If I start moving it, it lets me. It's not. There it is. It's not going to let me. It's going to be too much of a pain. So we're going to use the time tools, and we're going to jump up to quite a lot of a time interval. Let's say 200 seconds here. And I'm going to start pushing this. We're going to zoom in on the moon, really look at this. I'm going to start pushing this forward in time. And what I'm looking at is this periapsis going further north or further south? I noticed it was going further north, so I'm going to keep pushing it forward in time. And now it's starting to go back to the south again. So that means I went past the ideal spot. So I'm going to come back this way a bit. And you can notice there's quite a lot of leeway. There's a lot of sort of a section in here where it doesn't seem to be moving much at all. The amount it's moving is actually pretty trivial. So the exact timing of this is not that big a deal. I think where it is right now is close enough. So we can see here we need to come still a little bit further north. So I'm going to turn down the scale again a little bit, maybe go up by 1 meter per second intervals. Now you can see as I'm pushing it northwards, it's also pushing it outwards away from the moon. To deal with that part, be using these radial, these teal parts. These are the radial vectors, and if you take a look at our trajectory, we're on an arc. We're actually part of an ellipse really right here, and we have a radially inwards, right? If we look at this curve, this is kind of pointing towards where if this went all the way around, where the center of that curve would be, and this one is our radially outwards vector. And we use those to kind of push our trajectory more outwards or push our trajectory more inwards. So let's get back to looking at it from the moon's perspective. So again, what I'm looking for is to get that periapsis just to touch the orbit. I can see I got to come up a bit, but we're into really fine adjustments. A little up, a little more in. So, and you know, you can decide how much patience you have for all of this. I think that's looking pretty good right about there. So we got ourselves this tiny little 16.7 meter per second burn that's coming up in about an hour and a half. So let's get to that. I don't have to wait for this to get down to 0. The exact timing is not that important. I'll put this on the maneuver node, get ready to go. Now, one thing to notice is our projected burn time is 1.8 seconds, or 0.8 of a second. I mean, that's pretty short. So that's telling us that we have kind of too much thrust really to do this very accurately. So we're going to turn this thrust way down here. And then we're going to again look at this from the moon's perspective. And we're just going to burn a little bit. Again, I'm starting just right now. I don't need to wait for anything in particular. You can take as much time as you want with this because the timing of this burn really isn't at all critical. So we're just going to very slowly burn this upwards. Boom. Next, well, we got to get ourselves into the moon's sphere of influence. So now we got to look here. Now comes the part where we're going to need to do our capture, but also at the same time we're going to match this orbit. So we're going to put our capture burn right here at Periapsis. And what we need to do is start to reduce this. And what we're targeting, we've got a capture now, but we're in no way matching the orbit that we're shooting for. Now let's take a look now at the contract parameters. And we can see here we need an apoapsis of 208.07, a periapsis of 30.618, and an inclination of 164.5 degrees. The inclination being more than 90 is due to the fact that this orbit is actually going around the moon in, I like to think of it as backwards, but it is a retrograde direction. The moon rotates in this direction. We call that direction prograde, and all the bodies in Kerbal Space Program, including the vast majority of bodies in our own solar system, rotate in the same direction that we call prograde. If you're going in the opposite direction of that, we call that retrograde. So this is a retrograde orbit, and when you see an inclination that's more than 90 degrees, that's telling you you are going into a retrograde orbit, which from our perspective actually is no big deal. It just determined which side of the moon we were coming from at the very beginning of all of this. Now, if the only numbers that we had here were the apoapsis, the periapsis, and the inclination, all you had to do is make sure to match those. You didn't have to exactly match this orbit. But we don't just have that. We have this longitude of the ascending node, which is 319.9 degrees, and this argument of periapsis, which is 316.8 degrees. Let's talk about what those mean. It actually isn't essential to being able to do this contract, but it might be information that you might be interested in. So the longitude of the ascending node, because this orbit is inclined, there's a spot where the orbit comes down and crosses the moon's equator right around here. We call those things the nodes of the orbit. Where we are from, what are we going? We're going this way. Again, we're going backwards. So from here to here, this is ascending. The orbit is ascending as we go from right to left. Again, this feeling backwards. So we call this the ascending node. There's one on the opposite side that is the descending node. If you can imagine taking a line from the moon's center, connecting it to the ascending node, and then continuing it onwards like an array that's just going out towards the stars. And if we pick an arbitrary point somewhere and draw a line from that to here, we can create an angle. That angle is called the longitude of the ascending node. Now you might be going, this point here, this is arbitrary. Yes, we all have to agree on what that point is. Now, the way Kerbal Space Program decides what direction is that arbitrary direction is on day 0 at the very beginning of your game. The standard direction is the direction straight towards the sun. Of course, as we orbit the sun, that direction changes, but the game keeps track of that. Moving on to the argument of Periapsis, kind of the same deal. Again, we imagine a ray going from the center of the moon out to Periapsis, except this time, our common point of reference is actually a line going to the ascending node, with the angle being measured along the plane of the orbit. And with the longitude in the ascending node and the argument in Periapsis, along, of course, with the periapsis and apoapsis and inclination, you pretty much define any orbit. And as fun as all this is, it isn't even really necessary. Truth of the matter is, you don't have to really think about it, because if you can match this orbit, including where the apoapsis and periapsis are, you've pretty much got this. That's what you got to be thinking about. So how are we going to be doing that? Well, first off, what I want to do is realize that our orbit's coming in at the wrong inclination, right? So we're coming in like this. We want to match this inclination. And again, to affect that, well, we're going to be using these normals, the normal direction and the anti-normal direction. If you've noticed now, actually, the anti-normal is going up on your screen while the normal is going down on your screen. They have flipped because our direction is retrograde around the moon. So if I start burning in this anti-normal direction, notice what's happening here to my orbit. It is being pulled upwards towards the direction that I want. Now, as it's pulling upwards, notice as well that my apoapsis is changing. So I have to be a kind of aware of that, as well as where my periapsis is will be changing as well. So you have to kind of correct for that. Do I have to go a little bit more retrograde? Yeah, I do. And again, you can do this with the pull sliders like this, or if you want, you can do it with the gizmo that's down here. I kind of like the gizmo, so I'm going to keep playing with the gizmo. So we need to come a little bit more anti-normal. I need a lot more on the scale there. We need to bring our apoapsis in a bit. And again, all I want to do is get this apoapsis to be roughly in the same ballpark as where it's supposed to be, which is 208. There we go. That's in the right ballpark. How's our inclination doing? That ain't terrible. Okay. But we're still, this would actually get, these two conditions roughly right, not quite yet. We're getting our inclination right, but we need to get the longitude of the ascending node and the argument of periapsis right. In order to do that, we need this apoapsis not only to be the right number, but to be here. Okay. In order to do that, we need to push this trajectory outwards, away from the moon. This part of the trajectory needs to move away from the moon. Well, moving outwards either towards the moon or away from the moon, that's the radial direction. Specifically here, we want to move radially outwards, so we need to do the radial outward part. Notice what happens here. If I start pulling this, how that orange trajectory is coming outwards like that. Of course, in doing that, I have also affected everything else. So you can see how you have to start playing. I can see now I need to do more retrograde. But in playing around with this, notice as I bring this inwards that we're getting now our apoapsis and our periapsis close to where they want to be. You don't have to match these numbers precisely. In fact, it doesn't have to be crazy close. So how close you want to be is kind of your own personal level of patience. I tend to be a pretty pedantic kind of guy, so I'll play with this for a while until I get it as close as I feel like I can get it. If you don't want to be that patient, well, you're probably a healthier personality than me. We are pretty much matching the yellow orbit. Our apoapsis and periapsis are in the right places, and they have the right values, which means we should be matching all of these parameters if we perform this 343 meter per second burn. Okay, let's get her done. Now, one thing you do have to be a little careful about with these burns is you want to make sure, and this depends also on your settings, but as we come towards the moon here, I'll speed this up a little bit. You can see our green communication line. We're going to have a zone here where that's going to be blocked by the body of the moon. So you want to make sure the place where you perform your burn is still within sight of Kerbin. And if that means you need to move it away from where its ideal spot is, well, then you've got to do that. Right now, I think I'm going to be all right, so I'm just going to kind of go for it. And by the way, although you can do this from map view and watch how your orbit all changes, that can be kind of fun. I prefer this view. I think it's a lot prettier. You can perform it based on the maneuver and just watch these this contract requirement. When this contract requirement goes green, you can stop burning. There. They just checked off. They just went green. We have to maintain stability for 10 seconds. That just got achieved. That just means don't do anything for 10 seconds. I don't know, in case you were doing some finagling, trying to cheat your way. But right now, let's expose our solar panels nicely. We got ourselves a nice, well, okay, nice is a very relative word, isn't it? We got ourselves an orbit. But an orbit that does meet these contract parameters. And if you don't get the required orbit in a single burn like I just did, don't worry about it. As long as you get your capture, you can spend as much time as you want tweaking that orbit until it meets the contract requirements. Before we wrap this all up, I do want to take a moment to sincerely thank my two newest patrons, Todd DeWolf and Floris Gagestein. Thank you very much. Your support is very much appreciated, as is the support of all of my patrons. And I mentioned earlier in this tutorial that this probe actually does have a secondary purpose. I want to turn this into an effective relay satellite for the moon. But in order to do that, it needs to be in, well, quite a different orbit than the orbit that it's in right now. So we're going to spend time next episode looking at how we can go about tweaking our orbits to get them precisely where it is that we want them to be. And until then, I thank you for watching and hope to see you next time.